Alright guys, welcome back to Java Full Stack Made Easy session 85. In this session, we will be talking about the global exception handling in Spring. So let's see what exactly is this global exception handling and how do we handle it. Now, in my previous codes and everything, I have written a Spring Data JP application, the CRUD application that performs create, retrieve, update and everything. So if you are not aware about it, you can watch the previous videos and learn the things, because this session will be an extension of the previous one. So here we will be talking about the concept of global exception handling. So first of all, just let me run this piece of code and see how things work. Now, once I run this piece of code, you can find out there are a couple of things in my code that are not following the industry standard. That means this application is not still production ready. Now, why am I saying that the application is not production ready, although we are following all the industry standards? So let me just search the superheroes that I have. So once you see that when I'm searching for the superheroes, I get all the superheroes. Now I want to search the superhero based on the ID which we have already written. Like for example, if I want to search the superhero based on the ID 1, so I should get only Virat here, right? So that's what I'm getting. And similarly, if I want to get, let's say, Rahul, whose ID is 5, so when I search for Rahul, I get Rahul, right? Similarly, like maybe if I try to search for an ID 6, that is because this application is hosted at the client end. Let's take for an example, if this is a e-commerce application, and in an e-commerce application there is a possibility that some product might be available with us and some products might not be available with us. For example, let's say if I have an e-commerce application and the customer is trying to search for men's shoes, if we don't sell men's shoes, at that time we have to tell the customer that the product that you are looking for is not found, right? So similarly here, when I'm trying to search for a superhero 6, so my application should actually tell me that the superhero that I'm looking for is not found. But when I click send on this, you notice that it is throwing me an exception. So an exception, we already know that terminates the flow of a program. It abruptly terminates the flow of a program. So as a programmer, we should always protect our program from being terminated. You can see that there is an internal server error here. Now, the problem is at the client side. We cannot restrict the client to enter the IDs that are available, right? So client might search for any ID because we are allowing the client to search the superhero based on a given ID. So if a superhero on a given ID does not exist, we have to tell our customer that this particular superhero does not exist, rather than uh, giving an exception like this. Plus, you can also notice that the exception is raised in my application here. That causes obviously the application to abruptly terminate. So we get an object not found exception. Now, how are we going to deal with these type of situations? So this is only one case where I have given an example, like finding a superhero based on an ID. It can be deleting a superhero, or maybe while creating a superhero, if we don't want two superheroes to have the same name, or we don't want to have like maybe 10, more than 10 or 20 superheroes in a universe. So all those things are considered as exceptions, right? So this is the exception that's being generated in my application. Now my focus will be on handling this type of exception. How will I protect my program from being terminated like this? So in Spring, we have global exception handling. Now, why do we use global exception handling? In Java, we have learned that an exception handling can be done by using a try and catch block. So instead of writing a try and catch block in every controller method, what we can do is we write one global exception handler class, and Spring will automatically call it when an exception occurs. What do I mean by that? That means, suppose now if I have this controller over here, this controller, I have this delete mapping, that is the delete method is there. Also I have a get by ID. So if I create an exception called as resource not found, if delete is throwing that exception or get mapping is throwing that exception, like both of them can throw that exception. So instead of writing a try and catch here and also here, and also in all other methods. So instead of doing that, I can create exception in one place, and whenever an exception occurs, irrespective whether it is because of the get or because of the delete and all, if we have written a relevant method, then obviously our Spring can go to the controller advice and then pick up that exception from there. So a simple explanation about this would be, instead of writing a try and catch block in every controller method, what we do is we write one global exception handler class, and Spring will automatically call it when an exception occurs. So let us go ahead and see what we are going to write in that global exception handler. So what all things we will be using? Once again, we will be using two of the annotations here. One would be the REST controller advice, and this annotation is used to handle exceptions globally for all the REST controller in Spring Boot application. With that, we will also be using another annotation called as the exception handler, and this exception handler is used to handle specific exception in Spring Boot. So let's go ahead and write the query to handle these exception. We will be creating an exception, and then we will now be handling those exception. So for that, once again, I will just create exception class. Now I'm going to create a class, and what I will do is I will put it into a package called as an exception. So let's call it as com.example.superhero.exception. So this is my exceptions package, and within this exception, now I want to create a custom exception. So my custom exception is because will be created for this particular ID not found. So I can call it as ID not found, or maybe a resource not found, or a superhero not found, anything which makes it meaningful. So let's call it as for now, let's call it as resource not found exception, or maybe a superhero not found exception. Anything can be created. Okay, resource not found exception. Okay, so I'm creating a custom exception class, and I'm calling it as resource not found exception. So now that this class is created, we know that in Java, to create a exception, custom exception, a class has to extend an exception class, right? So whichever type of exception that you are creating, whether you want to create a checked exception or unchecked exception, depending upon that, you inherit your class, right? So I want to create a unchecked exception here, so which will obviously extend, my class will extend runtime exception. And the moment I write this runtime exception, I want the message of the exception to be passed to its parent. So obviously what I will do is I'll create a constructor with argument here. So let's generate that, generate constructor using field. Okay, so I will create a constructor here that will take a string argument, and that message given in this resource not found will be sent here to the parent. Okay, so my custom exception is created. Now comes the next part, which is like, if an exception is generated, what do I want to return to the user, right? So that is the response data transfer object, the response DTOs. If you remember, we have created the DTOs before as well, right? So here superhero response DTO that we created was actually returning all the details about the superheroes. Now I want to create an DTO for an API error, right? So let's go ahead and create a DTO for an API error. So for this DTO, what I'm going to do is, since it is relevant to the exception, I will be creating this DTO in the exception package itself. So let's go ahead and create a new DTO here. So in this DTO, I will call it as API error. Okay, so let's call this as API error. This DTO, we can call it as API error DTO or anything. So, or else API error, or maybe a resource not found exception DTO, any meaningful name. So let's call it as an API error as for now. So when I create this API error, what I will do is I will give maybe I will create a property here called as the message. Okay, and then I will create, so let's make all these properties private so that we follow the Java coding standards. We have a message, and then what we will do is we will create maybe an int status as well. And then what we can do is we can create a timestamp and tell at what point of time that exception has occurred. So we can give this a type of timestamp as well. Okay, so it's again optional stuff. We may or may not include it. If we want to give it, we can give it, or we may even ignore that part. So as for now, I will just give it so that we also understand how we deal with this. Okay, so let's say local date time, and that would be my time stamp. Okay, so we know that whenever we are creating these entity classes here, then we require the constructor, the default one. Then we require the constructor with argument, the constructor using field. Then we require the getters and setters. So let's generate the getters and setters. And also we will have a toString implemented here. We can obviously make use of the better approach. We can go for the Lombok, or we can also use the Java 8 records as well. So since I have not used records in my previous DTOs and everything, so I'm following that same standard here as well. Fine. So what all is created now? Now my resource not found custom exception is created, and also the DTO, that is API error, is created. Now let's go ahead and create a main thing, that is our global exception handler. So in this package itself, I will be creating a global exception handler. Now this is gonna be again a class itself, and I will call it as global exception handler. We can give it more relevant name as well. I am giving it as global exception handler since this is a demonstration, and you should know what exactly the concept is all about. Okay, so let's call it as the global exception handler. Now in the global exception handler, as I told you in the while starting this session, that we will be using a couple of annotations, which is the REST controller advice annotation and the handler annotation. Now what is this REST controller advice annotation? This REST controller advice annotation is used to handle exceptions globally for all REST controllers in a Spring Boot. That means if we have more than one controller and any of the controller method generates an exception, relevant exception can easily be caught rather than writing try and catch for every single method. So there are actually two annotations are there. One is the controller advice annotation, one more is the REST controller advice annotation. I'm using a REST controller advice annotation because it's a combination of controller advice as well as the response body. So it automatically returns JSON response when an exception occurs. So that is why I'm using this REST controller advice. Now let's handle the exception, the custom exception. So for that, obviously to handle the exception, we use another annotation called as the exception handler. You can also read about the details of the annotations that I'm using. You can just hit a control space and read out the details about the annotations. So now I'll be using an exception handler. Now what exception I'm handling here, that has to be provided. So we have created a resource not found, right? Resource not found exception. So that is something which we want to handle. So I will be writing it here, resource not found exception. Okay, so then this exception handler, I will add it on top of a method. So since I'm done with creating classes, I'll go into the full screen mode, and this is of this type. This type of exception is what I'm handling. Whenever the resource not found exception occurs, we need to run this particular method that I am writing here below. So instead of directly returning that uh, this particular error message here, this response has to be given. Okay, so here I will say public once again the method, and I will call this as the response entity. Now response entity of what type will be returned here? I will be returning a response entity of type API error. You can also see that the same type of things I am doing it inside the controller as well. So if you look at the controller here, response entity, so this is what I'm returning, right? So usually I'm returning a superhero responses. Most of the time I'm returning a superhero response itself, but in this case when an exception occurs, I have to return the API error. Okay, so let's give some method name here. This let's call it as this will handle for what? Handle not found. Okay, and then this method again takes an argument which is nothing but the resource not found exception. So this is what it handles. Let's call it as not found exception or anything that we feel is correct. So this is gonna be our exception. Let's call it as not found exception. Then obviously this method has to return a response entity now. So what we will do is we will say this is gonna return a new response entity of type this. So for before that, since it is returning an API error, so I will create an instance of this API error now. API error is equal to new API error. So it should give the message. So here we are going to write the message. Also we are going to write the status and then we are going to give the timestamp as well. So three things I have taken there. So let's first give the message that it has to give. So the message that I want is nothing but the message that is coming from this resource not found exception, right? So the super message, so which is going to be not found exception. So I will say not found exception dot the get message. So this message has to be returned, and here the status has to be returned. The status would be the same. HTTP status code is something which I would like to return. HTTP status, and the HTTP status that I want to return here is going to be not found. Okay, and then I will return sorry, not found dot value can also be taken. So let's return that, and lastly the timestamp, and to return the current time I will simply say local date time dot now method I will call, so which will return the current date and time. So once that is done, let's return a new response entity of this type, that is the API error. Okay, so let's do a return new response entity of type API error obviously, and we know that it takes two argument, that is the object, which in our case is API error, comma the HTTP status, right? So in this case the HTTP status is what? The not found, right? So this is what I want to return as a response when an exception occurs. Okay, so that's it. When we are trying to trying to get that exception, handle this exception, so whenever the exception occurs, so it comes here and it handles it that way. We don't need to write a try and catch for that. Okay, now the next important part is we have to go for the uh, IMPL, right? So in the IMPL, what we have to search for is the method that is doing a get by ID. So superhero controller, this is our response. Let's go to the IMPL. Okay, so in the IMPL we have a get superhero. Let's check find by ID. So yeah, so here we are trying to find a superhero based on the ID. So when we are doing this find by ID, at that time we will say not just or else null is something that we were returning. Now what we will do is we will say uh, do this all this data. Oh, sorry, this is not find by ID, this is update find by universe, so that should be find by ID create hero. Okay, so let's find the method. So this is create superhero find all get by ID. So this is how we have written it as optional dot off. So instead of returning an optional stuff here, uh, what I will do is I will see uh, I will do a find by ID, and then directly what we will do is we will return, and we will throw an exception if the exception if the object is not there. So let's just put a comment on this, which is get by ID. So now we will say return repository dot find by ID, okay, and the provided ID. Then the find by ID actually returns us a superhero, but what we are returning here is a superhero response. So superhero needs to be converted into superhero response, which we have done in every single method by using a map, right? So map this to the response, okay. If like if the data is not found, in that case we will say or else throw. So what exception we are throwing now? Or else throw the resource not found exception. That's what we want to throw, right? So this takes new, sorry, resource not found exception. So this is what it will throw, and we will say superhero not found for the given ID, and this is the message that has to be returned back. Okay, so this is what we are trying to return, and instead of returning an optional here, what we will do is this is gonna return a uh, superhero response. Okay, so it will return a superhero response. Since this returns a superhero response now, which is our yeah, superhero response itself. Response DTO is something that we have created. Yeah, that is superhero response. And obviously we have to change that into the service as well. So it does not return an optional now, it returns a superhero response. Let's save that. And now in the controller, we were doing a service.getById.get. We will not do a .get because it's not returning us an optional. So let's just do that. Let's save it. And now let's try and run this and test our application. So first of all, now it is running. I'll just terminate this. Let's run this. All right. So once we are running this, now we will test this application. Once again, we will go to Postman once it is running fine. So we will first try and search for the ID 1, which is present. So that should give us the detail. So it is returning us the detail. Now we will search for an ID that is not present, which is 8. So in the beginning, it was actually throwing me an exception. Now you notice that it is giving me a message saying superhero not found for the given ID, status 404, that is not found. And then it is also giving me the time. Now when I go to the console, you can see the console is clean. There is no exception generated. So that's how we can create and handle exceptions in Spring Boot. So the concept is called as the global exception handling. Now in the global exception handling, the advantage of using the global exception handling is that instead of writing try and catch in every controller method, we write one global exception handler. So you can see that I've written one global exception handler. So whenever uh, an exception related to this resource not found occurs in the controller, so the Spring controller, Spring will automatically call it whenever an exception occurs. Okay, and whatever handler methods I have written, so relevant exception handlers will be handling those exceptions. Fine. So that is the power of making use of the global exception handling. Instead of we writing try and catch for every single Spring controller, instead of writing rest controller in the Spring controller, instead of writing try and catch for this, for every single method, we write the global exception handlers and we decide what all exceptions can occur, and any relevant exception occurs, it comes down here and handles that exception. So Here I'm using a REST controller advice. This annotation is actually a combination of the controller advice and the response body. What it does, it is used to handle the exception globally for all REST controller in Spring Boot application. And then we have used the exception handler as an annotation. This exception handler annotation is used to handle specific exceptions in Spring Boot. Okay. So I hope you are enjoying in the series and you have now understood how do we handle exceptions in the Spring Boot environment without writing try and catch block for every single method. So this is again a very important concept. Now what you can try is you can try creating this exception, or maybe you can try handling this exception. I have created for what? In the implementation you can see I'm generating, I'm throwing that exception for get by id. You can try doing that for delete also, like when the id is not present, right? So the delete was not throwing an exception. So what you can do is you can check this delete by id, you can check and you can do a throw here. When the id is not present, you can throw an exception and test whether your code is working fine or not. So here in this case, I have simply done it for the find by ID. You can do it for the delete. You can try in the delete as you first try and find it. If it is not found, there itself you can uh, throw a exception. Okay, if that does not happen, you do a repository dot delete by id, because this delete by id returns a void here. It does not return you a boolean value whether the given id is present or not. So for this, what you can simply do is you call this find by id here first, and if that find by id returns you something, that means let's say this delete, you can repository by delete also can be used. You can see that superhero. So what you do is you try and check if let me write that. So this delete, not delete all, this delete method takes the superhero object as well. You can see that. So what you can simply do is this entire stuff you can check. If an exception occurs, it throws an exception. If that exception does not occur, at that time it is going to return as a superhero, right? So you take that superheroes, okay, and you just say if it is not found, it is going to throw an exception. If it is found, it is going to just delete that. So you can simply implement it this way. Okay, and now let's see. For this map to response and all will not be required, because that's gonna return us directly a superhero. So here we are not taking any DTO and all. So directly we can write a find by ID, and if an exception occurs, so it is going to throw an exception. So that way you can test it in the implementation. I have added it. I have not changed it anywhere, right? So just an implementation is changed. Controller remains the same, and since the exception is of the same type, that is resource not found itself, the same exception. So in the global exception handler, I have already written it. So there would be no need to change anything else now. So let me just save it and stop this application. Let's run this application once again and test it for delete as well. So when I try to delete it now, first it is going to find it, right? So while deleting also, we are trying to find it first. And when I try to delete it, and if 8 does not exist, once I send it, it is still going to throw me the same type of exception, because there also I'm raising that exception. So that way you can control the exception. Same exception can be thrown by multiple methods. If you have different exceptions, you can create separate exceptions, and then you can handle those exceptions as well. So I hope you're enjoying in the series. The code, obviously, like I am following the standard, like every time I create a Java full stack made easy Spring day 85. So because this session is session 85, I'll be storing it into day 85 global exception handling. And since my entity and everything remains the same itself, I will be sharing only that code which I have modified here. So in this case, I have modified this return type of my service method. So I will first be sharing with you the service. So let's call it as the service. The rest all thing remains the same itself. So that is why I'm not sharing the other code. So this is the service, and then I change the IMPL. So let me give you the service IMPL. Then we did not we did change the controller for get. So I will be giving you the controller as well. Just one simple method is changed in the controller, which is for get by id. So here previously we were trying to do a service.getById.get, right? So because it was returning an optional to us, now it is not returning an optional, so directly I'm giving you that. Okay, so after the controller, what we have done is we have actually created three new classes here. One is the API error, then the global exception handler, and then the resource not found exception. So this is our exception stuff. So let's call it as exceptions, and within the exception I have the exception first, the exception class, which is simple as we used to do it in Java. Then we have the uh, DTO that we have created, which is our uh, API error. This is a data transfer object. And lastly, the global exception handler. Global exception handler. Fine. So let's go to the global exception handler now. That's it. So the URL is for what? The URL that you will be testing here is gonna be the HTTP localhost superheroes. You try for anything, that is gonna give you URL for Postman. URL for these are the endpoints. URL for Postman means these are the endpoints itself. Okay, where it is not there, so we will get an exception. And when an exception occurs in this case, it is not going to terminate the flow of a program, whereas it is going to give us the API error as response, because that is what we have written in our global exception handler. So you can see that it is going to provide us a response, which is the API error. So I hope that's done for this particular session. I hope you are enjoying in the series. If you are enjoying in the series, do comment on this video and share this to increase the reach. Fine, and encourage me to create more such content. Thank you for your patience. Thanks for staying in touch. See you. Have a nice day.